The courthouse had seen its share of trials, but on this morning, the atmosphere was unusually heavy, as if the walls themselves anticipated something extraordinary. Reporters lined the marble steps outside, their cameras ready, their voices rehearsed for the evening broadcast. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnished wood and coffee from the machines in the lobby. Every bench in the gallery was filled, some with townspeople curious about the case, others with those who claimed to have been there the night the raid went wrong. All of them whispered in hushed tones, eyes darting toward the front of the room. At the center of it all sat the defendant, Officer Michael Grant. He wore his uniform, neatly pressed, but his posture gave him away. He was stiff, too upright, as if holding himself in place to mask the storm beneath his surface. For years he had been celebrated, a decorated officer, a man trusted with some of the department's most dangerous assignments. But now, his future rested not in his own hands, but in those of 12 ordinary jurors who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, adjusting their jackets and skirts as they prepared for what promised to be a long day. The judge entered with practiced dignity, his black robe sweeping gently behind him as he settled into his seat. Judge William Carter had presided over countless trials, yet even he seemed aware that today would be different. His stern eyes swept across the room, silencing the gallery without a word. The scrape of his gavel against the wooden block reverberated, commanding attention, and in that moment the casual murmurs died instantly. The trial had begun. The prosecution table was stacked with files, photographs, and a laptop that glowed faintly. District Attorney Rachel Myers sat poised, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had built her career on holding law enforcement accountable when necessary, a rare stance, in a town where many still saw officers as untouchable heroes. For her, this case was not just about proving misconduct. It was about proving that justice applied equally, no matter the badge. Across from her sat the defense team, led by a silver-haired attorney named Jonathan Pierce. Calm, confident, and dressed in a tailored Navy suit, Pierce radiated authority. His strategy was clear: dismantle the prosecution's arguments one by one, paint the raid as an unfortunate but necessary operation, and above all, protect the reputation of his client and the police department. Beside him, Officer Grant stared straight ahead, his jaw set, while his canine partner, Rex, waited quietly in the hall until called upon. The jurors observed this silent battle of wills. Some of them appeared sympathetic to the officer, nodding slightly whenever Pierce spoke, as if already leaning toward his side. Others looked skeptical, troubled by the details they had already heard in preliminary testimony. Yet all of them understood that their verdict would ripple far beyond this courtroom. It would reach the streets outside, where protest signs had already begun to appear, some demanding justice, others defending the police. The gallery was packed with tension. In the second row sat a young woman clutching her purse tightly, the child's mother, Sarah Collins. She avoided looking at the officer, her eyes instead fixed on the polished wood of the jury box. Her face carried the fatigue of sleepless nights, the worry of what lay ahead for her child, who had been summoned to testify. Few people in the courtroom believed a 3-year-old's words would carry weight, yet her very presence added a layer of quiet drama. A bailiff moved briskly along the aisle, reminding latecomers to silence their phones. The occasional cough, the rustle of paper, the clicking of a pen, every sound echoed louder than it should have in the otherwise tense silence. The courtroom wasn't just a space of justice that day. It was a stage, and every person in it was a player waiting for the spotlight to turn. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his voice deep and deliberate as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have been called here to weigh the facts of this case and render a verdict based on evidence and testimony, not on speculation or emotion. You are to remain impartial until the end. Do you all understand?" The jurors nodded, though impartiality felt like a distant dream. Already, the undercurrents of tension swirled through the room, pulling them into the story that was about to unfold. Rachel Myers rose first, walking slowly to the center of the room. She paused, letting silence fill the space before she began. "This case," she said firmly, "is about accountability. It is about the actions of a man sworn to protect and the consequences of those actions when the power of the badge is misused. You will hear testimony. You will see evidence. And by the end of this trial, you will know the truth of what happened on the night of the raid." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. She did not raise her voice, but the determination in her tone carried across the room like a hammer striking steel. Pierce smirked slightly as he stood, buttoning his jacket. He stepped forward with the grace of someone who had rehearsed every move. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth, almost soothing, "you will hear many claims in the days ahead. But remember this: the burden of proof rests on the prosecution. They will attempt to paint Officer Grant, a decorated, loyal, and courageous officer, as reckless. They will attempt to sway you with emotion. But when we look at the facts, when we examine the truth without bias, you will see that this case is nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding. And misunderstandings are not crimes." The contrast between the two attorneys was striking. One spoke of accountability, the other of loyalty and service. Between them stood a jury who would have to weigh truth against perception, fact against feeling. Outside, the faint sound of chanting protesters seeped through the thick walls, reminding everyone that the world beyond these doors was watching. Every word spoken inside would ripple outward, carried on news broadcasts and whispered conversations in diners and grocery stores. This was no ordinary case. And yet, as heavy as the atmosphere already was, no one could have guessed that the most decisive testimony would come not from an expert witness or a seasoned officer, but from the lips of a child who barely understood the meaning of a courtroom. The stage was set, the players in place. The story that would soon grip the nation had begun, and every heart in that room felt the weight of what was coming. For years, Officer Michael Grant had been a name people spoke with admiration. His framed photos hung in the police station's lobby, smiling in uniform, medals pinned neatly to his chest. Local newspapers often featured him after major busts, calling him the town's shield. He had led dozens of dangerous raids, walked into places most feared to enter, and come out as the embodiment of order. To many in the community, he was more than a law enforcement officer. He was a symbol of safety. That reputation was the very foundation of the defense's argument. How could such a man, decorated, disciplined, and respected, suddenly become reckless? Attorney Jonathan Pierce knew this was the question that would hover in the minds of jurors, and he was determined to let it tip the scales in his client's favor. But reputations, as the prosecution would remind them, were fragile things. The night in question began like many others in Officer Grant's career. The narcotics unit had received a tip. A suspected dealer was storing weapons and drugs in a small, single-story house on the east side of town. The operation was meant to be routine, swift, forceful, and controlled. At least that was the plan. Sarah Collins, a young mother, remembered it differently. Her 3-year-old son had been asleep in the living room, curled under a blanket with his stuffed rabbit. She had been folding laundry when the pounding started at the door, followed by shouts she could barely make out. Seconds later, the door burst open and armed officers flooded the small space. Lights blazed, commands overlapped, and her son's startled cries cut through the chaos. And then there was the dog. Rex, Officer Grant's German Shepherd partner, lunged forward with a bark that seemed to shake the walls. Sarah screamed, pulling her son into her arms as the animal strained against its leash, teeth flashing. To her, the moment was etched in terror, the fear that her child would be bitten, the disbelief that this storm had crashed into her quiet home. The raid ended almost as quickly as it began. No drugs were found. No weapons were recovered. The target address had been wrong. But the damage was done. Neighbors spilled into the street, recording with their phones, their voices overlapping in disbelief. News spread quickly. Another botched raid, another family traumatized. But this time, the story had a face. A toddler whose frightened sobs had been captured on video by a neighbor. By the next morning, clips of the child crying as officers left the house were already circulating online, sparking outrage. District Attorney Rachel Myers seized on that outrage, but for her, it wasn't about politics or media attention. It was about the core question. What happens when those sworn to protect misuse their power? Her team began piecing together the sequence of events. Officer Grant had approved the raid. Officer Grant had brought the K-9 into the home. And Officer Grant had, according to Sarah, ignored the pleas of a mother who feared for her child's safety. The defense pushed back. They emphasized the officer's clean record, his years of service, the countless times Rex had been praised for saving lives rather than endangering them. Mistakes happen, Pierce argued, but mistakes aren't crimes. He reminded everyone that policing was messy, unpredictable, and often misunderstood by civilians who had never felt the adrenaline of kicking down a door in the dark. But Myers had something stronger than arguments. She had witnesses. Sarah's testimony was compelling, her voice trembling but clear, as she described the night her son had been caught in the storm of flashing lights and barking dogs. Neighbors confirmed her account, speaking of the panic that spread through the street. Even one officer, testifying under subpoena, admitted there had been confusion about the address. Still, the case wasn't airtight. The defense hammered away at inconsistencies, pointing out small discrepancies between the witnesses' stories. How loud had the dog barked? Did it actually lunge, or did it only appear aggressive because of the leash? Was Sarah exaggerating the danger because she was angry about the raid? Pierce reminded the jury that emotions could distort memory, and memory, especially under stress, was unreliable. That was when Myers made her most controversial move. She petitioned to allow the toddler to testify. Gasps had filled the courtroom when the request was granted. Some called it a stunt, others a desperate gamble. How could a child so young contribute meaningfully to a case built on facts? But Myers argued that the child had been there, had experienced the raid firsthand, and that his words, however simple, might reveal the truth in ways adults could not. The defense bristled, seeing the danger. A child's innocence was disarming. Jurors might not weigh his words as technical evidence, but they would feel them. And feelings, Pierce knew, could tilt verdicts as effectively as hard proof. Meanwhile, the town outside the courthouse grew divided. Protesters lined the streets each day. Some carried signs that read, "Justice for Sarah and her son." Others carried banners that said, "Support our officers." Arguments flared at coffee shops, church gatherings, and school pickup lines. Families who once waved at each other from porches now stood on opposite sides of a widening divide. Inside, the tension only deepened. Reporters filed stories that painted the trial as a battle over more than one raid. It was a referendum on policing itself. Was Officer Grant a hero unfairly targeted, or a man who had crossed a line with devastating consequences? The jurors, instructed to avoid news coverage, couldn't fully escape the pressure. They felt it in the stares at the gallery, in the murmurs they overheard when leaving for lunch, in the weight of knowing that their decision would echo far beyond the courtroom. And at the center of it all was a 3-year-old child. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The case that began with a veteran officer and a highly trained K-9 had come down to whether a toddler's memory could shift the scales of justice. Some jurors questioned whether such a young voice could be trusted. Others wondered if that very innocence made the child the most trustworthy of all. As the second day of trial closed, Judge Carter reminded the room to return with clear minds and open ears. But clarity seemed impossible. Outside, protesters chanted louder. Inside, the attorneys sharpened their strategies. The defense prepared to showcase Rex as the picture of loyalty and discipline. The prosecution readied the child for what would become the most unforgettable moment of the trial. The case had begun as a question of procedure, of tactics and mistakes. But it had evolved into something larger, a clash between power and vulnerability, reputation and truth, authority and innocence. And everyone, from the jurors in their seats to the strangers standing in the back, knew that the next testimony would change everything. The courtroom doors creaked open with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Every head turned instinctively, conversations halted mid-breath, and even the scratching of pens paused. A hush fell over the room as Sarah Collins entered, her small son holding tightly to her hand. He was tiny, almost swallowed by the oversized blazer someone had draped over his shoulders to make him look more formal. In his other hand, he clutched a worn grayish rabbit, its ears frayed from years of being pulled through sleep and storms of tears. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor, every step echoing like a drumbeat. The boy's eyes darted from one unfamiliar face to another, scanning the crowd of strangers who stared back at him with curiosity, pity, or skepticism. He shifted closer to his mother, pressing against her leg as if she could shield him from the weight of the moment. Sarah whispered something soothing, her lips brushing the crown of his head, and then urged him gently toward the witness stand. Even the judge, usually firm and imposing, softened his expression as he leaned forward. "Take your time," Judge Carter said, his voice steady but gentler than before. The words weren't only for the child. They were for everyone. The room needed reminding that this wasn't just another adult witness, prepared and practiced. This was a 3-year-old whose world had already been shaken once before. The bailiff pulled out the chair at the stand, lowering it so the boy could climb up without help. Still, his legs dangled far above the ground, swinging nervously as he sat. His rabbit sat on his lap, as though summoned to stand trial beside him. From the prosecution table, District Attorney Rachel Myers studied the child with careful eyes. She knew this was a gamble. Jurors could easily dismiss his words as childish confusion, but if his innocence came through, if his truth felt uncheckable, it could break through walls of doubt no adult argument had managed to pierce. On the other side, Jonathan Pierce leaned back in his chair, lips pressed thin. His eyes flicked toward the jurors, gauging their reactions. He saw one man in the front row already leaning forward, softened by the child's presence, while another crossed his arms as if bracing against sentimentality. Pierce's strategy was clear: remind the jury that emotion was not evidence. But he also knew deep down that the optics of cross-examining a toddler could make him appear cruel. It was a razor's edge he would have to walk carefully. The boy glanced nervously at the microphone in front of him. His small fingers brushed it lightly, and then he pulled his hand back as if it might bite. Sarah's eyes filled with quiet tears as she watched. This wasn't the kind of moment a mother ever imagined. Her child, barely out of toddlerhood, sitting where hardened criminals and seasoned officers had sat. The judge leaned forward again. "Young man," he said kindly, "do you know why you're here today?" The boy blinked, then looked at his mother for reassurance. She nodded softly. To talk," he whispered. His voice was so faint that several people in the gallery tilted their heads to catch it. "That's right," the judge said warmly. "Just to talk. You can hold your rabbit if you want. No one here is going to take it away from you." The boy squeezed the toy tightly, then nodded. Myers approached slowly, crouching slightly so her eyes were level with his. She didn't want to tower over him, didn't want to frighten him with formality. "Hi there," she began, her tone gentle. "Do you remember me? We talked before, remember?" The boy hesitated, then gave the faintest of nods. "That's good," she said, smiling softly. "You don't have to be scared. We're just going to talk about that night when the loud noises happened. Do you remember that night?" His little face changed, his lips pressing into a small line. His body stiffened, and his rabbit was pulled closer to his chest. The courtroom held its breath, watching, waiting. "Yes," he whispered finally. "Can you tell us what you remember?" Myers asked carefully. There was a long pause. The boy swung his legs, his shoes bumping softly against the chair. Then, in halting words, he began to speak. "I was sleeping. Then the door go boom." His small hand shot out suddenly, fingers splayed, as if reenacting the burst. "I woke up. Mommy said she, but then. Men came, they had lights. Lots of lights. The jurors shifted in their seats, caught between fascination and unease." His words weren't detailed like an adult's testimony, but the simplicity of them carried an honesty that pierced through the legal jargon of the trial. "And what else do you remember?" Myers asked gently. The boy hesitated again. His lips quivered. His small voice cracked as he said, "The dog." The single word rolled across the courtroom like thunder. Eyes flicked toward the door where Rex had been seen earlier, waiting in the hall. The boy's hand tightened on his rabbit, his chest rising and falling quickly now. "The dog was scary?" Myers prompted, her tone softer still. The boy nodded hard, pressing his face briefly into his toy. "Dog bark loud. Dog, come to me. Bad dog." A ripple of sound, gasps, murmurs, spread through the gallery before the judge silenced them with a sharp gavel strike. From the defense table, Pierce's jaw tightened. This was precisely what he had feared. Not facts, but feelings. And yet he could already see the effect, rippling through the jury. One woman dabbed her eyes discreetly with a tissue. Another man shook his head slowly, troubled. Myers thanked the boy, placing a reassuring hand on the edge of the witness stand before stepping back. She didn't push further. She didn't need to. The moment had spoken for itself. But the defense had their turn. Pierce rose, his expression calm, but his mind racing. He walked slowly toward the boy, each step deliberate. He knew every eye in the room was on him, ready to judge not only his words but his tone, his body language, the slightest hint of intimidation. "Hello there," he said, his voice unusually soft for a man known for courtroom theatrics. "You're very brave for being here today. I just want to ask you a couple of questions, okay?" The boy clutched his rabbit tighter, but nodded. "Do you remember what you were dreaming about that night, before the noises woke you up?" Pierce asked. The boy blinked. "Cars," he said simply. "And when you woke up, it was very loud, wasn't it?" "Yes, and scary?" "Yes." Pierce smiled gently, as if coaxing agreement. "Sometimes, when we're scared, we remember things a little differently than how they happened. Do you think that might be true for you?" The boy tilted his head, confused. He looked at his mother, then back at the attorney. "Dog barked," he said firmly. "Dog bad." The gallery erupted again in whispers, and Pierce froze. He had hoped to plant doubt, to suggest memory was flawed. But the boy's stubborn innocence had turned his question into a reaffirmation of fear. Judge Carter's gavel struck once more. "That's enough for now. The child has spoken." As Sarah gathered her son into her arms and carried him from the stand, the room remained heavy with silence. Everyone present knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. For all the talk of strategy, evidence, and legal burden, it was the words of a 3-year-old, simple, fragile, unfiltered, that had shaken the courtroom to its core. And the trial was only just beginning. The air in the courtroom had thickened, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The 3-year-old boy sat on the witness stand, his legs dangling above the floor, swinging nervously. The large leather chair dwarfed his small frame, making him look even younger, almost swallowed by the weight of the moment. The rabbit toy rested in his lap, its tattered ears smoothed over and over by tiny hands searching for comfort. The prosecutor, Rachel Myers, stood a few steps away, careful not to loom too close. She had spent nights rehearsing this exact exchange, knowing every syllable had to be delivered with caution. Too soft, and the child might retreat into silence. Too sharp, and the defense would pounce, calling it manipulation. "Sweetheart," she said gently, crouching slightly to meet his eye level. "Do you remember sitting in this very chair just a little while ago?" The boy nodded, gripping the rabbit tighter. "And do you remember telling us what scared you that night?" Another nod. His lips pressed into a firm line, as though he'd locked the memory away. Rachel gave him a soft smile. "You did very well. Thank you for being so brave." She turned back to the jury, her expression measured but purposeful. Let them see, she thought, that truth can come from the smallest voice in the room. From the defense table, Jonathan Pierce leaned back, watching with the faintest trace of a smirk. To him, the boy was not a threat, not yet. A toddler's words were fragile things, easy to dismiss as imagination. But Pierce knew what was coming next, and his confidence grew. Because in the hall, waiting behind those tall oak doors, was his star witness. The dog, Officer Grant's canine partner Rex, was more than just a piece of evidence. He was a symbol, a loyal protector with a record of saving lives and stopping criminals. To the defense, Rex was the ace card, a living embodiment of discipline and service. Pierce had no doubt that his entrance would sway hearts. Who could look into the steady eyes of a trained German shepherd and call him dangerous? But for now, the room's attention was locked on the boy. "Do you feel safe here?" Rachel asked softly. The child's eyes flicked to his mother in the gallery. Sarah gave him the smallest nod of reassurance. "Yes," he whispered. Rachel smiled again. "That's good. You don't have to be afraid. Nothing can hurt you here." Her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to the defense. "Nothing can hurt you here. Not even the memory of a dog." Pierce rose slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. "Your Honor," he said, "with the court's permission, the defense would like to introduce a piece of living evidence." The judge arched a brow. He already knew what was coming. "Proceed." The double doors opened. A faint clicking of claws against the floor echoed through the silence before the dog appeared. Rex entered with the precision of years of training. His handler walked at his side, a firm grip on the leash, though it was hardly necessary. The German shepherd moved with poise, ears alert, eyes steady, his glossy coat catching the fluorescent light. He was a picture of discipline, his every movement a testament to control. The jurors leaned forward almost unconsciously. One or two even smiled faintly. To many, the animal looked less like a threat and more like a hero, the kind of dog children dream of as loyal companions. But not this child. The boy froze in his chair. His small body stiffened, his rabbit toy crushed against his chest as if it could shield him. His wide eyes locked onto the dog, and the room felt the shift immediately. The energy crackled, invisible but undeniable. Rachel's gaze sharpened. This was the moment she had both feared and anticipated. The boy's reaction wasn't coached. It was pure instinct. And instinct carried weight. The handler guided Rex to sit near the defense table. The dog lowered obediently, tongue lolling slightly, as calm as a statue. Pierce smiled warmly, gesturing toward the animal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "meet Rex, decorated, disciplined, and loyal. A partner who has protected this community longer than most of us have lived in this town. Is this the face of recklessness? Or is this the face of service?" The jurors studied the dog. Some nodded slightly. Pierce pressed forward. "This is the very animal the prosecution would have you believe terrorized a child. But as you can see, Rex is gentle, controlled, trained, a professional." He paused, letting the silence amplify his words. Then he turned his gaze toward the boy on the stand. "Would you like to say hello to Rex?" The room gasped softly. Even Judge Carter shifted in his seat, brow furrowing. The boy's small fingers tightened around his toy. He shook his head violently, burying his face in his mother's lap. His muffled voice trembled out. "No. Bad dog." The words were simple, barely audible, but the impact was electric. The gallery erupted into whispers, cut off quickly by the judge's gavel. Pierce's confidence faltered for the first time. He had expected curiosity, maybe even shyness. What he hadn't expected was the raw, unfiltered rejection of the very animal he'd hoped would save the case. Rachel's eyes locked on the jury. Some members leaned back, their expressions sobered. Others glanced at the boy with pity. Whatever credibility Pierce had hoped Rex's entrance would build was now complicated by the child's visceral reaction. Still, Pierce wasn't finished. He forced a calm smile, gesturing again toward the animal. Children are easily frightened. Loud noises, strange places, unfamiliar faces. Fear can color their memories. What you've just seen isn't proof of danger. It's proof of childhood. But his words felt weaker than before, swallowed by the weight of the boy's trembling voice. The boy peeked out from behind his rabbit, his face pale. His eyes never left the dog. And though he said nothing more, his silence screamed louder than any attorney's speech. Judge Carter cleared his throat, his voice steady. "That will be enough for today. The child has testified. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gavel struck once, a sound sharp enough to jolt the room into movement. The gallery buzzed instantly, whispers flying like sparks. The reporters scribbled furiously, knowing tomorrow's headlines had already written themselves. "Child calls police dog bad." Courtroom stunned. As Sarah carried her son out of the courtroom, his small arms wrapped tightly around her neck, the jurors filed out silently, their minds heavy. And in the defense's corner, Jonathan Pierce sat down slowly, his eyes narrowing. The strategy had backfired. The image of the boy's fear would linger far longer than his polished arguments. For the first time, Officer Grant's confidence cracked. His jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. He stared at the empty witness chair, realizing that his fate, once cushioned by his medals and years of service, now dangled in the fragile testimony of a terrified child. The dog lay quietly by his side, oblivious to the storm he had just stirred. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The next morning, the courtroom was packed even tighter than the day before. Word had spread quickly through town and beyond. A toddler had looked at a police canine and called him a bad dog in open court. It was the kind of moment reporters loved, simple, shocking, and impossible to ignore. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding signs and journalists jostling for space. Some banners demanded justice for the child, while others defended the officer with slogans like, "Trust the badge, trust the dog." Inside, the atmosphere was charged, buzzing with anticipation. Jurors filed in with stern expressions, each aware of the weight of their duty. The gallery whispered as the bailiff called for order, the murmurs rising and falling like waves against the walls. The entire room seemed to hum with one question. Would the dog appear again? At the defense table, Jonathan Pierce smoothed his tie, his face a mask of calm confidence. In reality, he had spent most of the night replaying the previous day in his mind. The child's words had been simple, but their impact had been devastating. The jury had felt something: pity, fear, maybe even anger, and that feeling had left cracks in his carefully laid strategy. But Pierce was not one to back down. He knew that jurors, no matter how swayed by emotion, still wanted to see evidence. And Rex, the German shepherd with years of training and a flawless record, was evidence. To Pierce, Rex was the embodiment of discipline and trustworthiness. If he could shift the narrative away from fear and back to facts, the case could still be salvaged. The judge entered, robe flowing behind him, and the gavel struck sharply against the block. Court is now in session. Prosecution, defense, are you ready to proceed? Rachel Myers stood first. Yes, Your Honor. Pierce followed with a nod. The defense is ready. The morning testimony moved slowly at first, with officers describing standard raid procedures and explaining how K-9 units were trained. Jurors listened politely, some taking notes, others staring ahead with blank expressions. But the energy in the room shifted the moment Pierce requested Rex be brought in again. The double doors at the back creaked open. The faint sound of claws clicking against the polished floor echoed across the room, and every head turned. Rex entered, his handler walking confidently beside him. The German shepherd moved with steady purpose, neither distracted by the crowd nor startled by the whispers. His coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his ears perked, his eyes sharp but calm. To the casual observer, he looked less like a weapon and more like a soldier, proud, noble, unshakable. The jurors watched closely. A few smiled unconsciously, the corners of their mouths softening at the sight of the animal. One woman in the back row tilted her head slightly, clearly struck by how calm he seemed. Ladies and gentlemen, Pierce began, gesturing toward the dog. This is Rex. You have already heard about his years of service. You have heard about the countless raids where his discipline prevented officers from being harmed. You've heard how he apprehended suspects without excessive force. Today, you see him for yourselves. The handler commanded Rex to sit. The dog obeyed instantly, lowering to his haunches with mechanical precision. His gaze fixed ahead, unwavering. This is not a wild animal, Pierce continued, his voice strong, confident. This is not a threat. This is a partner, trained, reliable, controlled. Do you see fear in him? Do you see aggression? Or do you see loyalty? The jurors studied Rex. The dog's calmness spoke volumes. His stillness contrasted sharply with the boy's trembling words the day before. For a moment, Pierce felt momentum return to his side. But Rachel Myers was not about to let him control the stage unchallenged. She rose slowly, her expression cool, her eyes fixed on the jury rather than the dog. Ladies and gentlemen, do not be fooled by appearances, she began. Yes, Rex is calm now. Yes, he is obedient now. But dogs, even trained dogs, are not machines. They react to environments, to commands, to fear. You heard the testimony yesterday. A child, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, remembered this dog as his source of terror. That memory cannot be erased because Rex looks peaceful in this controlled setting. Her words cut through the stillness like a blade. Some jurors shifted, their gazes moving uneasily between the boy's empty witness chair and the dog sitting so still near the defense table. Pierce interjected quickly, sensing the shift. With respect, Ms. Myers, the child's words were not evidence, they were emotion. And while emotion may stir sympathy, it does not prove wrongdoing. This dog's record is flawless. Not once in his years of service has he bitten an innocent person. Not once has he acted without command. Are we really going to condemn a decorated officer and his partner based on the confused fear of a toddler woken in the middle of the night? A murmur swept through the gallery. Some nodded at his logic. Others frowned, unconvinced. Rachel stepped forward, her voice sharper now. Confused fear? Or truth untainted by politics, training, or defense strategy? The child has no agenda, no reason to lie. Sometimes, the purest truth comes not from rehearsed testimony, but from innocence. You've seen this dog obey in a courtroom. But what you must remember is what happened in that home. A home where no crime was committed, where no drugs were found, and where a child was left shaking in terror. The clash between the attorneys was palpable, their words bouncing off the walls like opposing forces in battle. Rex remained still, unbothered by the storm around him. His calmness was both his greatest strength and his greatest liability. To the defense, it was proof of discipline. To the prosecution, it was irrelevant, a distraction from what mattered most. One juror, an older man with silver hair, scribbled something quickly in his notebook. Another, a younger woman in glasses, bit her lip as she looked at Rex, then toward the gallery where Sarah sat with her son. The boy wasn't on the stand that morning, but his absence was as loud as his words had been. Everyone remembered his trembling voice. "Bad dog." The judge called for a short recess. The gavel struck, and people began to shuffle, the gallery buzzing with speculation. Reporters whispered into recorders, already crafting headlines. At the defense table, Pierce leaned toward Officer Grant. "They saw him," he said in a low voice. "They saw control. We can still turn this." But Grant wasn't convinced. His eyes flicked toward the jurors, noting their conflicted faces. The boy's testimony had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Medals and records could polish his past, but the jury wasn't just weighing facts anymore. They were weighing feelings. And feelings had a way of lingering. Rachel watched the jurors too, her jaw set with quiet determination. She didn't care how calm Rex looked. To her, the child's memory was all the jury needed to remember. When court resumed, the tension was sharper, the air heavier. The dog sat quietly still, but the battle lines had been drawn more clearly than ever before. And though the day ended without a verdict, one truth was clear. Rex's presence in the courtroom had not silenced the child's words. If anything, it had amplified them. The courtroom seemed to lean forward with collective anticipation as the bailiff guided Sarah and her little boy back to the witness stand. The jurors had barely settled from the recess, but every gaze snapped toward the child. His presence alone carried more weight than any evidence logged, any report filed, or any testimony given by seasoned officers. He clutched his rabbit again, its fur frayed and its button eye loose, but to him it was armor. Sarah crouched beside him at the witness chair, murmuring words only he could hear. The boy climbed into the seat slowly, his legs dangling once more. His eyes flicked nervously toward the defense table. Rex sat at attention, unbothered, his handler standing silently at his side. The prosecutor, Rachel Myers, stood close but careful. She had prepared for this moment with painstaking detail, but preparation only went so far when your star witness was 3 years old. She knew every word would be scrutinized, every gesture dissected by the defense. More importantly, she knew she had to let the boy speak for himself, to let innocence shine through unshaped and unpolished. Rachel crouched again, softening her tone. "Do you remember where you are, sweetheart?" The boy's voice was barely above a whisper. "The room?" "Yes," Rachel said gently. "The courtroom, where everyone listens to you, where you are safe." She glanced at the jury, allowing the message to sink in. Safe. The child's safety, that was what the case had become about, no matter how the defense spun it. Then came the pause, a silence that felt like a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Rachel asked the question she had rehearsed over and over in her mind. Can you tell us who scared you that night? The boy shifted, his small shoulders rising and falling in a shaky breath. His fingers twisted into the rabbit's ear. For a moment, it seemed as though he might retreat into silence. And his gaze drifted. His eyes locked on Rex. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The jurors noticed. The gallery noticed. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. The boy raised his arm slowly, his hand trembling as though weighed down by something unseen. His tiny finger pointed across the courtroom. Straight at Rex, the silence was crushing. Every shuffle of paper, every cough, every nervous fidget ceased. The boy's finger hung in the air, unwavering despite the tremor in his arm. And then, in that small, high-pitched voice, he spoke. Bad dog, 2 words. Just 2, but they detonated through the room with the force of thunder. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor. The jurors froze, some with wide eyes, others with lips pressed tight as though bracing themselves against the weight of what they'd just heard. Rachel didn't move. She let the silence stretch, let the words reverberate in every corner of the room. She knew nothing she could say in that moment would carry as much weight as the child's truth. The defense, however, erupted. Pierce shot to his feet, his voice rising. Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. A child's fear, not fact. We cannot allow this court to convict a decorated officer based on the frightened words of a toddler. The judge banged his gavel sharply. Order. Sit down, Mr. Pierce. But Pierce wasn't finished. With all due respect, Your Honor, this is prejudice disguised as testimony. The boy is clearly scared, but fear does not equal guilt. Fear does not equal evidence. The judge's gaze hardened. And yet, Mr. Pierce, fear is exactly what this jury must consider. If the dog's presence inspires such a reaction, that reaction is relevant. Your objection is overruled. The gavel struck again, but its echo was drowned by the energy in the room. Rex remained calm, sitting exactly as he had been trained, eyes steady, body motionless. But his stillness only magnified the contrast. To the jurors, the dog was stone, but to the child, he was terror incarnate. Rachel seized the moment, her voice steady but firm. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she said, turning toward them, you have just witnessed something that no report, no officer's testimony, no rehearsed statement could give you. Raw, unfiltered truth. A child, too young to scheme, too innocent to invent lies, pointed at that dog and remembered fear. That is what this case is about. Not medals, not procedures, fear, and the trauma left in its wake. The jurors absorbed her words, their faces thoughtful, conflicted, shaken. Pierce sat down heavily, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time in his career, he felt the ground slipping beneath him, not because of opposing counsel's brilliance, but because of a child's unwavering honesty. Officer Grant's face was stone, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his chair. His heart pounded. He had trusted the image of Rex to save him, to cast him as the protector, the guardian. Now that same image was being used to dismantle his defense, piece by piece. The boy lowered his hand, retreating into his mother's arms. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath shallow, his face buried against Sarah's shoulder. His work was done. 2 words had reshaped the entire trial. The judge cleared his throat, his tone firm. The child has spoken. That is all for today. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell like a hammer. The room erupted into noise. The gallery buzzed, reporters scrambling for their exits, typing furiously into phones and recorders. Headlines were already forming. Toddler points at police dog, calls him bad in shocking testimony. Sarah carried her son out quickly, shielding him from flashing cameras outside the courtroom doors. The boy clung to her tightly, his small voice whispering only one thing as they moved through the crowd. "Bad dog. Bad dog." Inside, the jurors filed out slowly, their minds heavy, their expressions strained. Some avoided looking at Rex, though the dog had not moved an inch. At the defense table, Pierce sat in silence, his head bowed, his mind racing for strategies that felt increasingly hollow. Grant stared at his partner, the dog who had saved his life countless times, and wondered how loyalty could suddenly become liability. And in the prosecution's corner, Rachel closed her eyes for a brief moment. She knew the case was far from over, but she also knew that today, innocence had spoken louder than experience, and the truth had pointed its finger for all to see. The trial had shifted irreversibly, and the jurors knew they would never forget the image of that small, trembling hand. The courtroom was officially adjourned, but no one seemed ready to leave. The gavel had fallen, yet the echo of the child's words still reverberated in the air, as though the walls themselves were unwilling to let them fade. Bad dog. 2 words, uttered by a trembling toddler, had fractured the trial in a way no piece of evidence or seasoned testimony ever could. Reporters poured out of the room, practically tripping over one another in their rush to get outside and file their stories. Microphones waited on the courthouse steps, ready to broadcast those words across the state, across the country. Inside, the jurors lingered in their box, exchanging uneasy glances. They weren't allowed to speak to each other about the case, but silence was no shield against thought. Each one replayed the moment, the boy's tiny arm lifting, his finger quivering, his voice cracking as he declared, "Bad dog." It was impossible to dismiss. No matter how logical Pierce's arguments might be tomorrow, no matter how many commendations Rex had earned, the raw honesty of that memory clung to them like smoke. At the defense table, Jonathan Pierce sank into his chair, his confidence eroded. He had faced hostile witnesses, biased judges, even damning evidence before, but never had he felt so disarmed. It wasn't the prosecution's strategy that unnerved him. It was the purity of a child's perspective. You could dismantle lies, you could discredit adults, but how did you fight the honesty of a toddler who had nothing to gain and everything to fear? He rubbed his temples, silently cursing himself for bringing Rex into the room at all. The plan had been brilliant on paper. Show the jury a calm, obedient dog, and they would see reliability, not danger. But instead, it had given the prosecution their most powerful weapon, the child's unfiltered terror. Officer Grant sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the floor. The courtroom chatter swirled around him like a storm, but he heard only those 2 words. Words spoken not by a hardened criminal or a bitter rival, but by an innocent boy. His partner, Rex, sat at his side, still as stone, oblivious to the chaos he had become. Grant's chest tightened. For years, he had trusted Rex more than anyone, more than his colleagues, more than his commanders. The dog had saved his life twice, had tracked missing children, had kept drugs off the streets. Yet here he was, painted as a monster by the very innocence he had sworn to protect. Rachel Myers, the prosecutor, moved calmly as she packed her papers, but inside her heart raced. She hadn't orchestrated that moment. She hadn't needed to. Truth had risen on its own, unshaped by strategy, and it had landed harder than any closing argument she could have written. She glanced at the jury box as she slid files into her bag. Their faces told her everything she needed. They had felt it. Still, she knew not to get careless. A trial wasn't won on one moment, no matter how powerful. Pierce would regroup. He was too experienced, too calculating, to let his case crumble without a fight. Tomorrow, he would come back with a new angle, a new attempt to turn sympathy into doubt. But Rachel also knew something had shifted permanently. The jury couldn't unhear those words. In the gallery, Whispers rose like static. Some spectators shook their heads, murmuring that a child's fear proved nothing, that kids were scared of shadows, of thunder, of costumes on Halloween. Others argued that a child's fear was the most telling evidence of all, because children didn't hide their truths behind masks of logic or pride. By the time the bailiff cleared the room, the story was already spreading through the city. On the courthouse steps, cameras flashed as reporters shouted into microphones. "Bad dog child testimony rocks police misconduct trial." Headlines appeared online within the hour, a phrase repeated so often it seemed to take on a life of its own. That night, television anchors debated it in studio panels. Experts argued over child psychology, canine training, and the ethics of bringing a dog into a courtroom. Some praised the child's honesty, others called it unreliable. But no one could deny the impact. 2 words had taken a local case and turned it into a national spectacle. Meanwhile, Sarah tucked her son into bed in their small apartment, the boy clutching his rabbit tightly under the covers. His eyes still darted toward the doorway, as though he expected Rex to walk in at any moment. She kissed his forehead and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "You're safe now. Nothing can hurt you." But deep down, she feared the trial had only begun to reopen wounds her son would carry for years. Back in his hotel room, Pierce paced like a caged animal. He rehearsed rebuttals in his head, arguments about imagination, about suggestion, about the unreliability of toddler memory. He scribbled notes, crossed them out, and started again. But every version sounded hollow. Tomorrow, he would need to stand in front of 12 jurors and convince them to forget the sight of a child, pointing his finger in terror. And no matter how polished his words, he doubted they would be enough. Rachel sat at her own desk, reading over reports, her lamp casting long shadows across the room. She wasn't celebrating. Not yet. She knew Pierce too well. He would fight back, and he would be ruthless. But she also knew something he didn't, something she had seen in the jury's eyes. They hadn't just heard the boy's words. They had felt them. And feeling had a way of outlasting facts. In his silence, Officer Grant poured a glass of water in his apartment and stared out the window. The city lights blurred through the glass as memories of raids and arrests flooded his mind. He had always believed his badge, and Rex's presence meant protection, meant safety. Now he questioned if people saw something different. Not guardians, but intruders. The boy's words haunted him, not because they were strategic, but because they were real. And Rex, lying on his mat at Grant's feet, yawned and curled into sleep, unaware that his very existence had become the axis on which his handler's future now turned. The next morning, as the courthouse loomed once more and the crowd gathered outside, one truth was undeniable. 2 words had changed everything. Bad dog. And those words would echo until the verdict was reached. The courthouse was silent when the jurors filed back into the box. After 3 days of deliberation, their faces betrayed little, a practiced mask of neutrality. But the weight of their decision was etched in their posture, in the way their shoulders sagged, in the way their eyes darted briefly toward the child and his mother before fixing firmly on the judge. Sarah clutched her son against her chest in the gallery, rocking him gently as if he were much younger than 3. His small hand clung to the ear of the rabbit, worn smooth now from days of nervous rubbing. He didn't understand the meaning of the moment. He didn't know what a verdict was, or what it meant for the man in uniform seated across the room. But he knew the room was heavy, and he felt the eyes of strangers watching. At the defense table, Jonathan Pierce sat stiffly beside Officer Grant. His tie was loose, his knuckles pale against the wood. He had crafted a closing argument that bordered on desperate, weaving together commendations, character witnesses, and technical reports. But even as he delivered it, he had sensed the futility. You could stack facts like bricks, but they couldn't block out the echo of a child's voice. The judge cleared his throat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged woman with sharp glasses and a steady tone, rose. We have, Your Honor. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs. His chest felt tight, his palms damp. Rex lay at his handler's feet, as calm as ever, his presence both comforting and damning. The foreman unfolded the slip of paper, her eyes scanning it before she spoke. On the charge of misconduct in the execution of duty, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit like a blow. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's arms tightened around her son, who squirmed slightly at the sudden noise. Reporters scribbled frantically, their pens scratching across paper, recording history in real time. Grant's jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't speak. His training kept him still, but inside he felt hollow, as though someone had reached into his chest and scooped out his future. He glanced down at Rex, the dog resting peacefully at his side, and for the first time in years, he saw not a partner, but a shadow of the fear he had unwittingly caused. The judge banged his gavel, restoring order. Sentencing will be determined at a later date. Court is adjourned. The room erupted the moment the gavel fell. Some cheered, others shook their heads in disbelief. Protesters outside shouted triumphantly, their chants echoing into the chamber through the thick doors. Justice for the child. Mingled with support our officers. In a chaotic clash of voices that underscored the deep divide the case had carved in the community. Sarah hurried from the room, shielding her son from the swarm of cameras and microphones waiting beyond the doors. The reporters called after her, desperate for a quote, but she kept moving, whispering softly into her boy's ear. It's over, baby. It's over now. Inside, Rachel gathered her papers with methodical care. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She knew there was no victory in a case like this. A man's career was destroyed, a family's trust was shattered, and a child carried scars invisible to the eye. Still, she allowed herself one small breath of relief. The jury had believed him. They had listened to the smallest voice in the room and found it powerful enough to convict. Pierce slumped into his chair, defeated. He had built a career on dismantling arguments, on tearing through testimony like tissue. But against 2 words, he had found himself powerless. His client's future would now be measured in years, not badges. Grant rose slowly, his hand brushing over Rex's head in a gesture of habit more than affection. The dog wagged his tail once, oblivious to the storm around him. For years, Rex had been his pride, his proof of service, his partner in survival. Now, the very sight of him would forever remind people of fear, not safety. As officers escorted him out, Grant's thoughts churned. He wasn't sure if he hated the child for what he'd said, or pitied him for what he'd endured. He only knew that 2 words had stripped him of everything he thought uncheckable. In the days that followed, the case became a national spectacle. Talk shows dissected it endlessly. Commentators debated whether the verdict was justice or overreach. Social media filled with hashtags. Hashtag bad dog trial. Hashtag justice for the child. Hashtag protect our police. Memes spread, late-night comedians joked, and activists marched. But beneath the noise, real lives had changed. Sarah enrolled her son in counseling, sitting beside him as he learned to draw pictures of his fears and give them names. The rabbit remained his constant companion, but slowly, with each passing week, the grip of his nightmares loosened. He began to laugh again, small bursts of joy that reminded Sarah of who he was before the raid. Rachel moved on to other cases, but the boy's voice lingered in her memory. Whenever she prepared for trial, she remembered how truth could come in the simplest form. It wasn't always the polished statements or the expert witnesses who swayed a jury. Sometimes it was 2 words from the most unexpected place. Pierce buried himself in work, though his confidence was fractured. Late at night, he replayed the trial in his mind, searching for the moment he lost control. He always arrived at the same point: the finger, the words. Bad dog. He knew there had been nothing he could do to erase it. That realization haunted him. And Grant, once a decorated officer with a sterling record, disappeared into quiet obscurity. His badge was stripped, his uniform folded into storage, his reputation in ruins. He moved away from the city, Rex by his side, retreating into solitude. To the public, he was a villain. To himself, he was something worse. A man who had believed he was doing good, only to learn he had left terror in his wake. Years later, people still remembered the trial. They remembered the headlines, the debates, the images of protesters on the courthouse steps. But more than anything, they remembered the moment a 3-year-old pointed his finger and spoke 2 words that changed everything. Words so simple, yet so devastating in their truth. Bad dog. And with those words, innocence had held a mirror to power, and power had crumbled beneath the weight of honesty.